Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I checked in with my advisor last night and I told her I feel like I'm at some sort of celebrity convention because I'm putting faces to all these names of researchers and other people that I respect so much. But I digress. My name is Cara Schulte. I'm a fourth-year doctoral candidate at the University of California, Berkeley, and I'm also a researcher for an organization called Climate Rights International. And all of my work focuses on the intersection of extreme heat, health, and human rights. I have portfolios of work on heat and reproductive rights, on rights-based climate litigation, and then what I'll be talking about today, extreme heat and labor rights. So I thought I would start out by sharing a photo and a story. This is a picture I took in Dhaka, Bangladesh in the summer of 2024 of a woman named Raina. She is a garment worker. She's been a garment worker for the last 20 years. And her job is to sew pockets onto denim trousers, sometimes hundreds of trousers every day. She works about 10 to 14 hours per day, 6 days a week, and she makes roughly 17,000 taka per month, which I think is about 120 euro. And when I met Raina in May of 2024, she was 6 months pregnant with her third child. And the heat in Dhaka that summer was so intense that at one point schools across the entire country shut down for a week, but still Raina had to go to work. And when I asked her what it was like to work through those conditions, she said to me, "My body is burning, but still there's no break at all. I have to complete my work. I'm suffering in the heat, but I have to do my job." And I think this example showcases what public health research and qualitative research does so well in the context of climate change. And that's demonstrating that extreme heat isn't just about rising temperatures, but rather who's forced to endure them. And I'll talk a little bit more about my research, but it's not just about Raina. There are 70 million workers in Bangladesh alone who are exposed to excessive heat on the job every year. So backtracking a little, for those of you who saw the movie earlier this week, we know that workers are increasingly vulnerable to heat, and this is particularly concerning in developing countries where exposure to heat tends to be greater and workplace protections tend to be comparatively less robust, particularly in the informal sector, which dominates in many of these regions. And, when we think about workers in extreme heat, our minds very often go to rural workers and outdoor workers. And so what my team and I tried to focus on in this project were urban workers and indoor workers that often get left out of the extreme heat conversation. So we know we have this big data gap with workers in developing countries who are among the most vulnerable, but we still have really limited research on the ways in which extreme heat affects workers in these contexts. And importantly, in the limited data that does exist, the voices and perspectives of workers are often left out. And these voices are critical because they can help provide a nuanced understanding of the problem and also the pathways through which heat-related regulations are likely to affect workers. So my team and I set out to address this data gap by conducting a qualitative study. In particular, we wanted to interview vulnerable workers in 3 industries in Dhaka. So we looked at garment, delivery. So we interviewed both gig workers and rickshaw pullers and construction workers. And I say vulnerable because many of these workers fall under that informal category in the Bangladesh context, or are indoor workers that are often left out of discussions regarding extreme heat. So in collaboration with the NGO that I work for, Climate Rights International, and UC Berkeley, we partnered with local groups, including Global Worker Dialogues, the Center for Climate Justice Bangladesh, the Bangladesh Institute for Labor Studies, and of course I consulted with Shiro, who spoke yesterday. And we ended up interviewing over 60 workers, and we basically just talked to them about how the heat was impacting their lives and their livelihoods. And what was really important to this research was letting workers define their challenges, their struggles, and their needs in their own words. So Unfortunately, there are too many health effects to get into right now, but to give you a general sense of the types of things we heard about, here's a quick list of what workers reported that can really help paint a picture of the suffering caused by occupational heat. We heard workers say a lot of things like, my body can't bear the heat, or my body stops working involuntarily because my muscles are too tired. This was a young female garment worker that I spoke to who said sometimes when it's extremely hot, she can't even move her hands. We also heard about mental health impacts. We heard from workers stories of fear, anxiety, restlessness, and epidemiologic research, as we've heard this week, is increasingly linking heat exposure to different mental health effects and even suicide risk. And findings suggest that these risks are particularly high for people living in tropical zones like Bangladesh. This is a local food delivery, rickshaw worker that I interviewed who said sometimes he feels like he's going to die. We also spoke with food delivery workers who said they felt extremely nervous when the heat was so high. And then we also heard about even more severe impacts. Fainting was something that came up quite a bit. Almost every worker that I interviewed had either fainted themselves on the job or had seen a colleague collapse in the heat. And unfortunately, combined with different occupational hazards in some industries like construction, this could lead to death on the job. So this is a worker that I spoke to. His name was Jamal, and he watched a colleague faint from an elevated surface and pass away. And he was not the only worker that I interviewed who had stories of colleagues dying in the heat. Oh, the slide seems a little messed up. So I'm going to run through this quickly because there's a lot to get to, and I actually have some new updates as of this week. But we also heard a lot about heat impacts on worker productivity. They told us that they worked more slowly in the heat, and oftentimes they had to work additional hours to make up for that lost productivity without additional pay. And on the flip side, we heard from workers who were not able to work as long in the heat that this resulted in income losses that were sometimes so severe that workers were not able to afford food. And so this is a rickshaw puller that I spoke to. He explains that his income reduces in the heat and sometimes his household can't eat. All of the impacts that I've talked about are, of course, horrible, but as a human rights researcher by training, what stood out to me the most were the ways in which labor rights abuses functionally acted as barriers to climate adaptation. So we heard a lot about supervisors cutting pay in the heat as workers slowed down, not paying them on time, and forcing workers to continue through dangerous conditions. We also heard about verbal harassment and threats. So workers said when they tried to stop to drink water or take a rest break in the heat, they were harassed. And then we heard a lot about inadequate access to safe water. I had workers tell me that the water in their factories or that they had access to while on the job was dirty, muddy. One worker said that the water in the factory was too hot to touch because it was stored in a metal container. And even where workers did have access to water on the job, there were tight production quotas that led them to limit their intake. So this is a garment worker, for example. Tasmiha had a production quota, like a certain amount of garment she needed to make every day. And she was scared that if she drank more water on the job, she would have to use the bathroom more, which would reduce her work time and she wouldn't be able to complete her daily quota. And so she said that she would deliberately restrict her drinking on the job. Excuse me, sorry. We heard also a lot about denial of medical leave and retaliation. So workers said that they fell ill in the heat, but they weren't able to take time off. I heard from one worker that he was actually fired after falling ill in the heat and not showing up to work for 3 days. And then this is a garment worker that I spoke to in Dhaka who said that many of the workers feared retaliation. They didn't want to speak up about the heat conditions because they were scared they'd lose their jobs. I'll run through this quickly because I see I'm running out of time, but we heard generally none of these workers had heat-specific safety training, so they weren't even aware of the hazards and didn't know how to protect themselves. And then more broadly, we heard about lack of accommodations for particularly vulnerable groups. So going back to Raina, who I said was pregnant, shared that, there were no changes to her workload during pregnancy, and in the heat, her work became twice as difficult. We did a deep dive into policy and enforcement gaps and also looked into corporate accountability, and we linked the hazards and abuses documented in our report to multinational brands, most often located in high-income countries. And as someone who straddles this line between academia and NGO work, it was really important to me that we take this research into the hands of people who could do something about it. And so we began communicating with the companies and brands we identified, and talking about having heat protections in their supply chains. And in that process, we also met with a body called the International Accord. And quick background, the International Accord is a legally binding agreement between trade unions in Bangladesh and Pakistan and fashion brands. And it was developed out of the Rana Plaza disaster in 2013. And it focuses largely on building and fire safety. But they're an authority on occupational health. So we met with them. We simply asked if they saw heat as an issue. And they responded, yes, we're getting all these complaints, but our complaints mechanism is separate from our inspection, our factory inspection and remediation mechanism. And so we submitted our findings in a formal letter. We convened a coalition of groups in all of these related fields, so labor rights, climate change, and fashion. And we urged them to expand their scope of work to include heat safety as a specific occupational risk. And this is where bridging the gap between academia and advocacy has its benefits, because my team and I at CRI were able to kind of conduct this lightning speed study because we already had the background research in place, we had our interview questions ready, and we didn't have to deal with IRB approval because we were working now from the NGO side. And so we did this rapid assessment in Pakistan because we learned that the International Accord's Pakistan arm was being renegotiated actually as we speak. And so for this study, we focused specifically on the garment industry because we had this advocacy target of international body that worked with fashion brands. And we worked backwards. So I ID'd factories that supplied major fashion brands that we had identified in our Bangladesh report. And our findings in Pakistan, we focused specifically in Karachi, were largely similar to what we found in Bangladesh. Workers in Karachi reported working through temperatures as high as 52 degrees Celsius. And we took these findings and we again briefed brands. We had a number of conversations, and some of the fashion brands actually confirmed to us following our distribution of our findings that they would vote in favor of including heat protections in this renegotiation of the Pakistan Accord. And then we submitted our findings again to the Accord's body. And I'm very happy to share that actually when I was at the airport waiting to fly here, we got confirmation from the International Accord in a letter that they've agreed to develop a protocol on heat stress based on the findings we shared. So it feels like a rare good moment in climate research. And this is really exciting because this agreement actually has teeth. It has a dispute resolution mechanism through which trade unions can bring arbitration cases against brands that fail to comply with the obligations that are outlined under the Accord. And this development will improve climate protections for over 3 million workers in Bangladesh and Pakistan who are currently covered under the Accord's jurisdiction, and will also apply to any other countries to which the Accord expands in the future. So, I think the lesson here is that climate adaptation is often thought of this very complex and expensive endeavor that requires full government alignment oftentimes. And I would just urge researchers to think about non-traditional pathways and advocacy targets that already have the structures in place for occupational health and safety enforcement, for example, but maybe aren't thinking about climate as a specific risk. Thank you.